Got some major developments to discuss regarding Russia and Israel. Now, prophetic implications, of course, to that relationship, as we've documented here in the newscast over the past several weeks. But to my mind, one of the most important stories to develop in that very tenuous relationship between Israel and Russia last week, and this was not reported in the mainstream media, but a very important story that Middle East media picked up on. Last week, Russia's ambassador to Syria, Alexander Efimov, made some very strong statements, accusations, condemnations of Israel over those Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Now, remember, Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes in Syria against Iran and Hezbollah over the past few years, and they're doing it quite literally under the noses of Russian forces, thousands of Russian soldiers stationed right there in Syria, who, by the way, are aligned very closely with the Iranian regime, with the Assad regime in Syria, with Hezbollah. Essentially, Russia is aligned shoulder to shoulder with Israel's greatest enemies. So that should send off alarm bells for you right away. And over the past few weeks and months, we've documented here in the newscast how Russia seems to be losing patience with Israeli activity in Syria. Take it back to January. Russian and Syrian fighter jets doing joint patrols, including over the Golan Heights. Also, we had a Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman back in February condemning Israeli airstrikes in Syria. We had Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, also in late February, saying that Russia does not recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He says that, hey, the Golan, that's the property of Syria and our good friend Bashar al-Assad. Folks, that is the tip of the iceberg. And Israel obviously striking that very delicate balance during this Russia-Ukraine war, trying to maintain good relations with both sides. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has acted as a mediator between Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine. So Israel in a very interesting position, a dangerous position, in my view, when it comes to what's unfolding with Russia right now. And now we have the condemnation from Alexander Efimov, and here is what he said, that Israel is escalating tensions, intentionally escalating tensions in Syria through its strikes there in an attempt to draw the West, Israel's Western allies, into Syria. He also said, even more strongly, and I quote him directly, that Israel is provoking Russia to react every time Israel carries out strikes against Iran and Hezbollah. Now, more on that in a minute, but remember, why is Israel conducting these strikes in Syria against Iran and its proxies there? Number one, Iran should not be in Syria at this point, should have never been there in the first place. But secondly, Iran is attempting to establish a forward base in Syria from which it can attack Israel from Israel's doorstep. They're driving closer and closer, or attempting to at least, to Israel's Golan Heights. And Iran and its proxies there are armed to the teeth with increasingly advanced weaponry, including those precision-guided missiles, PGMs for short, that we've talked about so much here on the newscast. So Israel naturally is acting to defend its citizens, its country, and pushing Iran back, striking them, striking these weapons transfers flowing through Syria into the hands of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So a very wise move, needless to say, by Israel, but clearly Russian officials, top Russian officials and diplomats are taking none too kindly to this continued Israeli activity in Syria. So we're watching that very closely, folks. The prophetic implications, eventually, I believe, although Israel and Russia have maintained good relations, the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made frequent trips to Russia to meet with Vladimir Putin. The current Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has also met with Putin, and again, he's playing that mediator role. But I believe a great betrayal is coming. A day is coming where Russia will turn viciously against Israel. Not the Russian people, but the Russian leadership. Perhaps it's Vladimir Putin, perhaps it's someone after Vladimir Putin, but I believe that latter days confederation that the prophet Ezekiel describes in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, the war of Gog and Magog, a funny name I know, but it's a name that you need to know. I believe Russia will lead that latter days confederation, which will include Iran. The good news is that confederation doesn't get very far, and the Bible is clear that God Almighty, the God of Israel, intervenes directly, and that invasion force perishes on the mountains of Israel.